Do you get is there a frequent flyer pass for Dragon? I hope so. Yeah, they're zipping around. I think on ground track they're going about 17,500 kilometers when they're at ISS's orbital altitude. If that sounds about right.
Yeah, I think it's 17,500 miles an hour.
I'm sorry, miles per hour. Thank you.
It's still extremely fast. So if you look just above the hatch, you see that ISS 20 flag. That is representing the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station, which we will actually be celebrating later this year. So for the past 20 years, I like to explain it to people as if you are under 20 years of age, you've never lived a day without humans in space. So for the past 20 years, we've had continuous human presence aboard the International Space Station. It's truly international. We have obviously our two upside down friends we see. They're getting a better look inside by turning in that direction. They are from Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. Looks like they are taking out the intermodule ventilation. That helps equalize the air in between Dragon's capsule and the rest of the International Space Station.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, while Dragon has been attached to the space station, most of its operations have been in what we call quiescent mode. So that's really just a low power state where we've only got monitoring on the thermal system, the propellant system, taking a look at some parameters in case we were to see anything that would trigger the Dragon's onboard automation to wake the vehicle up and let ground operators know something needs to be addressed. The onboard life support system is actually only used when we close the hatches and for brief periods when we are configuring the vehicle when we first arrive and periods when we're leaving, like right now. So that duct that they pull out, the intermodule ventilation duct, that actually provides clean, breathable air and circulates the air in the capsules, and providing that air from the International Space Station.
And it looks like hatch closure is soon to be underway.
Houston and Hawthorne from Endeavour.
Still working to take out some equipment inside Dragon, move it back into the space station.
Yeah, so as part of those activities, moving the intermodule ventilation duct, they activated, of course, the lithium hydroxide scrubbers on board Dragon. Cap and fan has been running. And I think we're just waiting on confirmation of hatch closure.
Yes, and I think they just called down that they are working on that, putting that into motion. We're getting one step closer to sending Bob and Doug home.
Closed for Endeavour.
SpaceX copies.
And Houston copies.
And we just got confirmation.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes a todos. Bueno, en este momento acaban de recibir la confirmación para que pueden cerrar la escotilla de unión con la nave. Ahí vemos allá atrás que se ve que están cerrando la escotilla. Eso que está en el medio es la esclusa, es una esclusa que luego de que cuando se vaya a separar la nave van a ventilar, o sea, van a equiparar la presión de eso con la presión exterior para poder separar el módulo, ¿no?
Now, as part of hatch closure operations, Bob and Doug actually inspected the seal on the interior surface of the forward hatch on Dragon. And we're talking about the forward hatch and the side hatch. The forward hatch is actually the part that's attached to the front, sort of the front portion of the International Space Station. So if you imagine the International Space Station flying in a direction around the Earth, the forward direction of it is what we're attached to. And that, if you were imagining the capsule sitting on the rocket, is actually at the very top of the rocket underneath the nose cone. So if you're imagining the rocket as it was on the launch pad, it's a little bit sideways right now. And there's a sealing surface on that forward hatch that Bob and Doug would have done an inspection on just to make sure that there's no foreign object debris or FOD that could cause a potential leak.
And looks like we may be stepping into a satellite handover. It happens commonly on the International Space Station, and it's called actually a TDRS handover, tracking data and relay satellite system. We're constantly moving from one to the next.
Yeah, so we actually use those tracking and data relay satellites as well on the Dragon vehicle. They provide our telemetry links. There's I believe they're in the geobelt. Hopefully that's correct. But they provide communications, uplink and downlink and commanding, actually, a downlink for us to command the vehicle as well if we need to step in on the ground side. Speaking of which, we actually have a view of mission controls in Hawthorne. So that is that's where our mission controllers are in Hawthorne. The folks who are issuing commands to the Dragon spacecraft are all sitting. In the third row there is the mission director, as well as, and here's an internal view of the Dragon spacecraft. We've got Bob in his, looks like his comfort garment, which would be what he wears underneath his suit. Nice to see the capsule getting all packed up.
And then another view from the International Space Station side of things. Looks like Anatoly Ivanishin flying out of view, and Chris Cassidy down there in between the hatches in that vestibule area. He is working through procedures to soon be closing the A-pass hatch on the space station side and prepare for depressurization.
Dragon, SpaceX, no response.
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit.
On cameras for your suit donning.
Copy, SpaceX. Thank you.
Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the vestibule, the space between the A-pass hatch and the forward hatch on Dragon is really just a small volume that is normally exposed to the vacuum of space when we don't have a visiting vehicle like the Dragon spacecraft. And we have to step through some depressurization steps once we have confirmed that all of those hatches are secured, both on the International Space Station side as well as on the Dragon side of the spacecraft.
So we just heard the call that Bob and Doug are go for suit donning. So the Dragon hatch is closed. They've said farewell to their orbiting friends for now until they're all reunited in the ground in the future. And they'll be going through that suit donning shortly. You did mention it looked like Bob Behnken was already in his comfort garment, that first layer of the suit.
Yeah, the comfort garment is it's basically like an athletic garment. Just helps them stay comfortable before they step into the suit. And the suit is largely a one-piece design. So the helmet is integrated into it. The boots are integrated into it. Really, they will unzip some interfaces on the suit, climb into it, zip all those attachment points up, and then there's actually an umbilical on the leg of the suit. So it's a kind of a connection that provides gases and electrical connections to the suit, so they can use the integrated microphones in their helmets, and it also provides them breathable gases for suit leak checks, and if we were to have one of those emergency scenarios, it would also provide pressurization to the suit. And I think notable to mention that these are different suits from what you might imagine for like the spacewalks and EVA suits. These are what are called intravehicular activity suits, meant for really activities inside the vehicle.
So what we just saw as Chris Cassidy was down there in between the hatches in that vestibule space, he was affixing that docking target that we mentioned earlier. I like to say it's like an X marks the spot because that's what the vehicles aim for when they arrive at the International Space Station. So one step closer to bringing Bob and Doug home. And we're actually really fortunate that the weather has turned out pretty good in the Gulf. Looking at a Pensacola landing site right now, we just, before we went on air today, we had the 2.5-hour...
Bueno, están informando que el tiempo está espectacular a la vuelta, así que no van a tener aparentemente por ahora inconvenientes. Están con los últimos ajustes.
Which opens up our opportunities for landing sites in the Gulf of Mexico. which Gary had actually mentioned earlier, Pensacola being the primary site today.
Yeah, so as they continue work on the APAS hatch, let's check in with Gary over on the International Space Station Mission Control Room side of things.
Stand by, Gary.
Thank you, Leah. We're watching the same view that you are seeing, Chris Cassidy working on that APAS hatch on the International Space Station side. As you saw, that hatch on the Dragon side closed. Now, this is an important set of procedures that Cassidy is working right now. You already mentioned the docking target. This is that rod with the X at the end of it. X marks the spot. As Leah mentioned, this is an important item to affix to that APAS hatch. Now, you see he set up a camera just outside of there, and he's also going to be taking some pictures for the ground teams to know exactly how the APAS was configured prior to closing, getting ready for some of those next crews. Now, you saw there was a white padding on the outside of it too. That's just for a safety measure as the crew was moving in between the hatches, but everything going according to plan here. That's expected to be closed about 10 minutes after closing the Dragon hatch, which was closed just about 10 minutes ago. So it should be closing very soon. The crew already just a little bit ahead of that timeline. So a few items coming up after that APAS hatch closure. Now you see that hatch is on the station side. There's going to be a space in between the Dragon hatch and the International Space Station hatch. That space is called the vestibule. So about 15 minutes after they close that APAS hatch, they'll give a go for depressurization of that vestibule that is all controlled from the Dragon side. But we'll be watching very closely here in Mission Control Houston. Now, the depressurization of that vestibule does take quite a little bit of time. It takes about an hour, actually, to get down to vacuum, but there's going to be a check at about 5 pounds per square inch. The check at 5 pounds per square inch is going to take some time. It won't take too long to actually get to 5 psi, but once they actually get there, bringing that vestibule down to vacuum creates a little bit of temperature swings. So we need that to dampen out a bit before performing a reliable leak check. That leak check will happen at the 5 psi mark, and then we'll continue down closer to depressurization towards vacuum. Now, that's all coming up very soon. The go, no-go for actual undocking to occur a little bit more than an hour after depressurization. That at about 4:20 p.m. Pacific. And if everything goes according to plan, so far the crew a little bit ahead of schedule. We'll get them undocked right on time. We're looking at 4:34 and 58 seconds p.m. Pacific time. Everything going great so far from the International Space Station side. Now back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Now that Dragon's hatch is closed and Bob and Doug have donned their suits, we'll be looking for the APAS hatch on the station side to close very shortly. APAS is an acronym that stands for Androgynous Peripheral Attachment System. So you can see why we use an acronym, and it's an integral part of the docking system. Before closing it, we saw Chris Cassidy working to attach that docking target to fine-tune any alignment for the approaching spacecraft. So it's not something required for the undocking, but obviously we need it to be there for the next spacecraft that arrives at that port.
Yeah, and Gary had actually given us a...
Anna, I got you loud and clear. Good to talk to you again today. How's everything going?
Things are great. I'm super excited to be here.
So I think what we heard there was a comm check between the core here and Hawthorne Mission Control up to the crew. That's a very good sign. That means that they're well underway into their suit donning procedures. Suit donning just referring to getting into their suits. And one of the first steps there is checking that the microphones work both in the cabin as well as in their suits. Now, kind of what we were talking about earlier, once we get through suit donning, which will have a couple of steps involved in it, first with these comm checks, and then we'll actually do some pressure checks to make sure that the suits are leak tight. Once we get through that, then we'll actually go through a quick poll. Mission control teams will verify that we're go to depressurize the vestibule, again, which is that space in between Dragon's forward hatch and the station's APAS hatch on the mating adapter, pressurized mating adapter on the forward module.
And as you saw some flashes in that area down in the vestibule, that's Chris Cassidy, commander of the International Space Station, down in that space. He's taking pictures, and he'll be sending those back down to the ground team so that they can check out how the hatch closure procedure went.
Están sacando fotos en este momento casi, que se le ven las piernas en el ingreso allí al módulo, y es lo que está haciendo, sacando fotos de los dos astronautas que ya están prontos para el reingreso.
Are all operating as nominal, and the volume actually in between in the vestibule, that pressurized area, which is now at about 14.7 psi, will actually vent that through the some vent valves on the Dragon side of the system.
So one of the two astronauts returning to Earth in Crew Dragon is Doug Hurley, the spacecraft commander for the DEMO2 mission. He previously flew on 2 space shuttle missions as the pilot on STS127 and again on STS135, which was the final space shuttle flight. Here's a closer look at NASA astronaut Doug Hurley.
Estamos viendo al astronauta Doug Hurley, que es el comandante de la misión, y acá vemos ahora la Crew Dragon en la DEMO2, unos momentos antes del despegue, ¿no? Esto fue el 30 de mayo pasado, y aquí está su familia, ¿no? Y su vida. Doug Hurley también fue piloto de la Fuerza Aérea, creo. Fue astronauta, anteriormente voló la última misión del Trasbordador Espacial a la Estación Espacial. Fue él quien iba al mando del Trasbordador y llevó la bandera que tienen arriba a bordo ahora, que la está volviendo a traer a la Tierra en esta misión.
Overwhelming in some respects.
Ahí vemos el despegue del Trasbordador Espacial. Es impresionante eso, la cantidad de potencia que necesitaban para levantar todos esos kilos, ¿no?
My wife on it. That is quite the emotional experience. My name is Doug Hurley, and I'm the Spacecraft Commander for the DEMO2 mission to the International Space Station.
Veíamos recién a la esposa de Doug Hurley, que también es astronauta.
We are doing the first crewed flight for NASA and for SpaceX. So this is the
Ahí tenemos de nuevo la Crew Dragon encima del Falcon 9 bloque 5 antes del despegue, ¿no?
entry, descent, and landing.
El día del despegue.
Wake up about 6 hours prior to launch. You'll eat breakfast. You'll do a medical check. You'll start to get your comfort garments on. You'll get a weather brief, and then you'll go get suited.
Esos nuevos trajes espaciales que utilizan ahora parecen muy modernos, ¿no? Son bien diferentes. Inclusive, bueno, el viaje que hicieron de aquí a la nave lo hicieron en un Tesla Y. 2 Teslas. Los vehículos más modernos que hay en este momento, por su tecnología, y bueno, esta cápsula espacial también, que es, a ver si tenemos sonido de ese motor. Genial. Sí, Aves nos pregunta si vamos a transmitir hasta que llegue. Sí, esta transmisión no va a ser continua porque son 19 horas de corrido y hay un lapso en el medio en el que van a descansar, pero sí, vamos a hacer la transmisión completa, o sea, la otra parte está en otro video, que ya pueden suscribirse también y para poder recibir las notificaciones. Así el próximo video pueden verlo también en vivo junto con nosotros.
See his hard work and his dreams come true for that.
It's been a huge amount of sacrifice and time away from home, but the fruits of our labor are coming to fruition.
Is NASA astronaut Bob Behnken. He's the Joint Operations Commander for DEMO2. He previously flew on 2 shuttle missions, STS123 and 130, and he also served a tour as the Chief of the Astronaut Office. Why don't we learn a little bit more about him?
Bueno, Hurley también voló en el Trasbordador Espacial, voló 2 veces, o sea, 2 misiones del Trasbordador anteriormente, así que son pilotos con mucha experiencia, por eso son elegidos para esta demo, que en realidad es un vuelo de certificación, lo que hicieron es certificar la nave.
There's always a balance of managing risk as you go forward to execute a test point and figuring out a way to collect the data. Okay, is that sound an expected sound, or we see a light? Is that light an expected light? What's the source of it? Does it sync up with something else that's going on or not? So trying to dissect all of that in real time in your head is, a lot of things happen like that on launching of a vehicle.
From St. Anne, Missouri, he is an Air Force colonel and flight test engineer. He flew aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour twice. Introducing NASA astronaut Bob Behnken.
My career at NASA has kind of spanned a couple of decades at this point. I arrived with the class of 2000, went through the training program, primarily focused on the
Bueno, ahí está mostrando cuando estaba entrenándose y con sus compañeros para las primeras misiones del transbordador. Ahí vemos un despegue del transbordador.
You can feel a little bit guilty of, hey, should I study one more thing, or is there one more piece of information I should get? Am I really prepared or not? So that's definitely different between where I was on my first flight and where I'm at right now.
I think for me personally, as a spouse, watching
Esta es la esposa.
everything that Bob has put into this over the last 5 years, the dedication that he's shown, the perseverance is pretty special for both of us, though. The way our minds work, it won't be until sort of the mission is complete that you have really a chance to savor it and celebrate it.
On a deeply personal level, I'm really excited that my son is going to get a chance to see me launch into space. Being an astronaut has been a little bit.
Bueno, continuamos viendo un poco más de la historia de ellos previo al lanzamiento, ¿no?
On board the vehicle that we need to accomplish to really make sure that it's good to go.
did this. We did a great job. We accomplished what we set out to do. Whenever he lets himself feel that and experience that success, that's what I'm really looking forward to for him. For me, I'm looking forward to when he touches down at Ellington and the NASA plane that brings him home again at the end of it.
Hola, ¿qué tal, Javier? Sí, el Ariane de ayer quedó suspendido. Sí, y bueno, como siempre, esa no da avisos ningunos, ¿no? Para cuándo va a ser el nuevo lanzamiento. Apenas tengamos novedades lo vamos a publicar, y si no, bueno, si nos enteramos unos minutos antes, lo hacemos también.
Cool. Great view on your screen. That's from a camera behind Bob and Doug.
Estamos viendo la cámara que tienen Bob and Doug ahora adentro de la Crew Dragon. Esa es la vista de adentro de la nave en este momento. Casi que no hay botones, es todo touch.
So there's confirmation of a couple of great milestones. Forward hatch is closed, suit donning is complete. We just completed suit leak checks. Everything nominal. Bob and Doug just raising their visors, get a little bit more comfortable.
Vamos a tratar de escuchar a ver qué es lo que nos dicen.
I love this view because it makes me feel like I'm in the back seat of Crew Dragon, just going along for the ride. We did have
sí, bueno, eso es como estar en el asiento trasero, ¿no?
Brief video as well as the beginning of suit leak checks. I've got a few milestones coming up. Next we'll be looking for that vestibule depressurization, bringing that space down.
Bueno, lo que tienen que hacer ahora y están haciendo es buscando que no haya pérdidas en los cierres de las escotillas. Recuerden que la nave esta está acoplada a la estación espacial por medio de una escotilla doble, que hay una esclusa en el medio. Y bueno, cierran las dos escotillas y comprueban de que está realmente todo hermético para poder hacer el desacoplado, ¿no?
The crew will actually be monitoring during the departure portion of the flight. On the way up, they had a couple of opportunities to perform some manual flight tests by piloting the vehicle and checking those out and seeing how it would fly if you ever had to. But fortunately, it is an autonomous vehicle. So the goal is that the astronauts are along for the ride, there to monitor and there to step in case anything were to go wrong. But it should be an autonomous flight home. We're not stopping for any of those flight tests along the way.
That's right. Just trying to take a look here to see what the vestibule is currently pressurized at. Taking a look at the data, it's about 14.1 psi, so pounds per square inch. For reference, at sea level on Earth, we're at about 14.7 psi, and if you're about 1,000 feet above sea level, then you're actually at about 14.1. Just happened to look that up earlier today. It looks like we might have lost the camera feed, might be another handover.
Probably so. We are waiting for that vestibule depressurization to begin. We're getting calls from the crew that they're getting ready for that. So things are moving along smoothly. Everything is happening on time for an on-time departure from the International Space Station today.
Yeah, and that call will actually be the ground side. We'll do a couple of checks, make sure that we're go and all of the data and telemetry on the Dragon side of the vehicle looks good and on the vestibule sensors look good. Then there should be a call to the crew from the core, letting them know that that we're planning to step into commanding vestibule depressurization, and then we'll actually issue that command. For this command, we are in joint operations. So what that means is the flight director in Hawthorne or in Houston at Johnson Space Center, the flight director of the International Space Station has mission authority for the mission. And any commands that we want to issue to the spacecraft will actually have to get permission from the flight director. And so some of those calls will be happening in the background before we actually begin that depressurization.
Dragon SpaceX for status.
Están preguntando por el estatus en este momento.
The ground has verified system reconfigurations for hatch closure are complete and they are nominal. The ground will step into vestibule depressurization shortly.
Bueno, van a empezar en cualquier momento con la despresurización, que es el primer paso antes del desacople.
At this point, and note that the hex is currently configured for maximum cooling.
Okay, copy off. 4.080 if we need to change the temperature. Appreciate it.
And some words going up to the Crew Dragon crew from, as you mentioned, the core, the crew operations responsible engineer here on the ground at SpaceX. They spoke with the teams in Mission Control Houston and decided, yes, they are almost ready to begin that depressurization of the vestibule. This is the exact opposite procedure that we saw on the way up. And sounds like vestibule depressurization has.
Bueno, el procedimiento que hacen ahora es exactamente el mismo que hicieron al llegar a la estación espacial, solo que al revés, ¿no? Mónica pregunta a qué hora van a regresar. Bueno, el ingreso a la atmósfera lo van a hacer mañana, luego del mediodía. Todo este proceso lleva unas 19 horas, porque tienen un tiempo de descanso entre medio para que no sea una doble jornada para los astronautas, si no se iban a pasar de tiempo, ¿no? Entonces lo que van a hacer ahora es se van a desacoplar de la estación espacial, van a alejarse un poco y van a colocarse en una órbita de reingreso, pero todavía se mantienen en órbita. Luego de todo eso, la transmisión la vamos a cortar, eso va a llevar un tiempo, yo supongo que una hora más en total. Y luego mañana lo que vamos a transmitir es la parte del reingreso, que es cuando se desacopla del trunk, o sea, de un depósito que tiene todavía adosada la nave. Y ahí sí hace el último quemado de motor para poder hacer el reingreso a la atmósfera, ¿no?
False leak from either the International Space Station side or the Dragon side. So we give it some time to equalize the temperatures, and once we feel confident that the pressure is
Carlos Ruiz nos pregunta por qué si va a esa velocidad se ve todo tan lento en el desacople, como si flotara. Porque entre las dos naves, o sea, entre la Estación Espacial y la Crew Dragon, no hay velocidad relativa. Esto como cuando vas andando en bicicleta y estás al lado de otra bicicleta que va andando junto contigo, ¿no? Si vos mirás la bicicleta que va al lado, está detenida, pero en realidad están los dos moviéndose, ¿no?
Yeah, and kind of wild to think, among the other fun facts I was looking up, so the pressure at Everest is about 4 psi. So that'll kind of give you a sense of this. The pressure in the vestibule right now would be about similar to you being at maybe like 12,000 or 13,000 feet.
Yeah, and very interesting. That's near the same pressure as in an EMU, or an extravehicular mobility unit, that the astronauts use when they go outside on a spacewalk. They keep that at 4.3 psi. That way they are more able to easily move their fingers and their joints, so that work outside isn't as difficult.
Something interesting to note on the extravehicular, or on the EMUs. So at that like roughly 4 psi, where you're not breathing the same mix of air that you would be breathing here on the ground. Here on Earth, we'd be breathing something like 70% nitrogen and then about 20-something% oxygen. You actually need the concentration of oxygen to be higher. So when you go to those lower pressures, those suits actually transition to oxygen, right?
And taking a look at the data, it looks like we are at 5.9 psi in the vestibule. So coming up pretty soon, we should be expecting that call of having reached that 5 psi level that we're waiting for that 25-minute check.
Mission controllers that you can see on your screen, specifically who we refer to as the systems officer, will be monitoring for the pressure. We'll also be looking for temperature checks on that area. The systems officer is actually responsible for the life support systems and thermal system on the vehicle, and so they're most familiar with that telemetry and able to make those calls for nominal leak check complete. And they'd also be responsible for checking that the vehicle configures into appropriate transition modes.
And I just heard that the initial depressurization of the vestibule is complete, looking at 5 psi, nearly on the dot.
So I think what we can expect next is a call from the core up to the crew to let them know that the thermal hold period is beginning. And then we will probably also hear when the leak check is complete and the results of that leak check. So we're kind of listening to the nets in the background. Just heard a conversation from the mission director prompting operators on next steps for start of this thermal hold period and then
Claudia, ¿qué tal? Bueno, en este momento estamos viendo, no sé por qué se cortó la transmisión de ellos, vamos a ver si tenemos otra imagen de otro lado, a ver, aquí la colocamos. Están preparando para cerrar la esclusa desde adentro de la estación espacial. Bueno,
so it looks like another handover of our TEDRS satellite systems. Those are tracked.
Volviendo a quien nos preguntaba, Janet. ¿Qué tal, Janet de Caldas? Bienvenida. Y Victoria, ¿qué está pasando? Bueno, están cerrando la escotilla que separa la esclusa con la nave. O sea, está la estación espacial, hay una esclusa y está agarrada la nave. Lo que hacen es verificar que no haya pérdidas de presión para poder desacoplarse, ¿no? Bueno, otra vez nos quedamos sin la imagen. Estamos viendo el centro de control de misión. Mónica pregunta dónde va a caer la cápsula. La cápsula en el océano frente a la Florida.
Give us an update?
I sure can, Shiva. We're seeing the same results of the vestibule depressurization.
Santiago, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes.
Went down pretty quick, but again, as you said, we're looking for that thermal stabilization before we perform the leak checks. We saw good leak checks from the crew's suit-up procedures. The suit's looking pretty good. And then we just saw Chris Cassidy aboard the International Space Station finishing out his closeout duties of the pressurized mating adapter. That was that long tube on the other side of the hatch that he just closed, putting some items there, getting ready for the next crew coming up later this year. He closed the today, closing both of the station hatches. With that, we'll continue to monitor this thermal stabilization.
So if we were to have some kind of weather those 12 hooks, hard capture hooks, are actually what also provides the seal as well. So they ensure that the vestibule has that.
Bueno, están cerrando la esclusa en este momento. Disculpen el tema de audio. Teníamos un problema acá que nos sale dos veces el audio. No sé si allí sale o no. Pero bueno, vamos a seguir así como estamos ahora.
So as you can see, NASA astronaut and commander of the International Space Station, Chris Cassidy, he's staying behind on the International Space Station for right now, and he'll return to Earth aboard a Soyuz in October. But he has just
Chris Cassidy es quien está ahora ahí cerrando la esclusa. Es el astronauta de los Estados Unidos que va a quedar a bordo de la Estación Espacial y va a volver en octubre a bordo de una nave rusa, una Soyuz.
by closing that node 2 hatch. And as you mentioned earlier, that's on the front end of the space station if it really had a front side. So that's where they're at. And you saw him taking some pictures, recording that process, and he'll be able to deliver those to the ground later for analysis and just to check out at how everything went, this first departure for Crew Dragon with a crew.
Good view from the interior of Dragon. We're looking at the pilot's side seat. So that's Bob Behnken.
Estamos viendo ahora dentro de la cápsula, la Crew Dragon. Vemos una de las cámaras. Hay dos cámaras que generalmente hemos visto. Es esta y otra que está detrás de ellos, como si fuéramos pasajeros en el asiento trasero, ¿no?
And Chris, I owe you shortly what the undock sequence time is.
And that was a call to Chris Cassidy on the space station, checking out and making sure that they were just echoing that they saw that node 2 forward hatch closure. Things progressing well for an on-time departure. When Doug and Bob got into the spacecraft today, they had a few housekeeping things to do. They wanted to make sure those footrests that you see right there are firmly attached for the ride home. And then you can see a window over to the right of your screen. Those have had some window covers on them.
¿Qué tal, Nélida? ¿Cómo te va? Sí, el tema es que lo que están diciendo no es nada no hay nada que aporte a la misión. En este momento lo que hacen es reducir las presiones en la esclusa que hay entre la nave esta y la estación espacial, asegurándose de que no haya pérdidas, y una vez que eso esté pronto, que le va a llevar, no sé, 30 a 40 minutos, ahí recién van a comenzar el procedimiento para desacoplarse y comenzar su viaje de regreso. Mientras tanto, digo, todo lo que escuchamos, a veces el audio en inglés, no aportan nada. Lo que están haciendo es agregar un poco de relleno nomás.
Almost rivaling the lights in the cabin. Now that window is actually right next to the side hatch, so you can see there's a black strip next to that window. That's actually a handrest, a handhold, and next to that is the side hatch. And that's actually what Bob and Doug will be egressing out of after they do, after successful reentry, parachute deployment, and splashdown.
Yeah, so that's what we saw the crew climb in. Once they crossed that crew access arm, that last place that they were on Earth in that white room, they climbed in through that side hatch, but that's not what's attached to the International Space Station. The nose cone on Crew Dragon opens up and, as you said, exposes those thrusters underneath, and they actually floated through that hatch. So they arrived through that one and departed through that one, but once they get back on Earth, that side hatch is the primary egress or exit from the vehicle for Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley.
Pablo nos pregunta por qué están en esa posición que parece acostado y no sentados como si estuvieran en un auto. Está comprobado que cuando están en esa posición es cuando se puede resistir la mayor cantidad de la fuerza de desaceleración o aceleración, lo que le llaman las fuerzas G. Y justamente en el viaje de reingreso van a experimentar fuerzas bastante fuertes y es la mejor forma de resistirlas, ¿no?
Splashdown in over 45 years. So actually on July 24th.
Sí, claro, llevan. Alexis pregunta si llevan algo de comer. Sí, claro, llevan de comer. Ellos ya desayunaron y bueno, comerán después fuera de cámara cuando estén en algún momento después de terminar la tarea del desacople, me imagino.
And then the Soyuz, which astronauts have been arriving in for the past 9 years, that lands on land in the steppes of Kazakhstan. So this one we're looking to land in the Gulf Coast. It means a much quicker ride home for Bob.
Hatches and help Bob and Doug egress on the recovery ship.
If you've ever seen any of that old Apollo footage, the astronauts actually used to get out in the...
Mónica pregunta qué se necesita para ser un astronauta. Bueno, lo primero, aparte de tener buena salud y estado físico, es conocimientos. Tener algún grado de física, de tecnología, ciencias, en fin, porque hoy por hoy es la parte más importante de lo que realizan, son tareas científicas a bordo de la Estación Espacial. En este caso no, en este caso este primer vuelo demo, los dos son pilotos de prueba, pilotos de jets inclusive, y tienen una gran experiencia en esto, y lo que están haciendo es un vuelo de certificación ahora. Están preparando para que esta nave, la Crew Dragon, y las futuras Crew Dragon que fabriquen, puedan ser piloteadas, como quien dice, manejadas por casi cualquiera de las personas que estén calificadas para eso, y que no necesiten tener tantos conocimientos de vuelo o experiencia de vuelo, ¿no?
So as we were watching this past week, this tropical storm become a hurricane, there was some concern about returning today, because we do have some recovery criteria. Landing in the water is a lot more difficult than landing on land, because you have to consider things like wave height and wind speed. And so we are looking at those spaces in the Gulf, and they're looking pretty good compared to, obviously, the spaces on the east side of Florida. But yes, we have to take into consideration what the helicopters can arrive in, and what all the boats can withstand, and what the the crew capsule itself can withstand.
Yeah, that's right. The hurricane Isaias moving up, I think, the east coast of Florida now, so hopefully folks are staying safe out there. I know Doug actually took some photos from the cupola of this hurricane as it's moving up the east coast. But luckily, no major impact to weather on the west coast. Good winds, no significant lightning, no significant rain is projected for the area. And I think importantly as well, the wave heights, which are important for the spacecraft, but also for the recovery ship to be able to get close, and for teams to secure the spacecraft and ensure that it's safe for recovery.
So currently we are in a hold period of the vestibule depressurization. That's the area between the hatches that the astronauts fly through, or float through when they arrive and float through when they depart. So we are holding at 5 pounds per square inch for 25 minutes to make sure that checks out, and they continue with depressurization after that. But Bob and Doug, as you can see, this view over their shoulder, it makes it look like we're on the ride with them. They have donned their suits, they are in their seats, monitoring everything on those screens aboard Crew Dragon.
Why don't we actually check in with Gary at Johnson Space Center in Houston, hear how things are going on the space station side, and how do things look at Johnson, Gary?
Hey, Shiva,
scenarios where they might need to interact with Dragon, and if it were to lose comms or have a thruster issue. But right now, very healthy vehicle. Haven't really seen any issues with Dragon during its 63-day stay at the International Space Station.
And if you are wondering, once Dragon departs today from the International Space Station, we're not going anywhere. We're actually going to be live all the way until they come home to Earth tomorrow. So some of the bigger things we can look forward to after undocking, we've got a couple of departure burns. The first two are going to bring Dragon up and over the International Space Station, and then the next two will bring it down and in front of the space station before a phasing burn later this afternoon to help it really sync up with its landing.
Están explicando que lo que va a suceder ahora cuando hagan el desacople, la Crew Dragon no se va a ir a ningún lado. Lo que va a hacer es separarse, colocarse primero encima y luego adelante de la estación espacial. Y va a mantenerse allí hasta que llegue el momento de hacer lo que es la de órbita, o sea, de sacarla de órbita para hacer el reingreso a la atmósfera.
And the perigee, so the apogee, if you can imagine the orbit of a spacecraft as an ellipse going around the Earth, the apogee is the highest point, or the point farthest away from the planet, and the perigee.
Nélida, que no sé si creo que respondí, pero preguntame de nuevo a ver cuál es, repetime la pregunta, que no lo veo entre todo lo que hemos escrito ahora.
kilometers below the International Space Station, but we'll be slowly reducing our perigee. And then later on tonight, Pacific time, we'll actually conduct what's called a phasing burn. And the goal there is to adjust the orientation of that orbit just so we get our orbital pathway to line up over the landing site where we will, or line up with a path that will cross over the landing site where we can, when we issue our...
Viviana nos pregunta a qué hora es el desacople. Bueno, de aquí en adelante, en cualquier momento. Están haciendo los ajustes de presurización para hacer justamente el desacople.
First couple of departure burns, they'll actually be able to take off their suits, and they won't need to put them back on or don them again until tomorrow, just before the deorbit burn. And then they'll wear them the entire rest of their ride home. But for the majority of the rest of the evening after the departure burns 1 and 2, they'll be able to take off those spacesuits, relax a little bit more, enjoy their ride in Crew Dragon. And while Crew Dragon was on the International Space Station, we actually conducted some habitability tests. Of course, there's 2 astronauts flying today, but our future crews are scheduled to have 4 astronauts. So we brought in a couple of the space station's current residents to test out what it's like to have multiple people in Dragon once it's in microgravity. Performed lots of tests inside the vehicle. They had a little sleep period.
¿Cómo se ajustan en sus asientos allí? Bueno, tienen ayuda. Tienen ayuda de los otros astronautas que están a bordo de la Estación Espacial. Los vimos la última parte cuando terminaban de entrar y de ayudaban a retirar inclusive las últimas cosas. Y la escotilla la cierran desde afuera inclusive, desde la Estación Espacial.
And go in about 7.6 kilometers per second, should be close to that 17,500 number that you probably hear pretty often.
Nos pregunta Carlos Ruiz. Carlos, te voy a pedir por favor que no repitas las preguntas 3-4 veces porque si no saturás el chat. A tu pregunta de si es todo el tiempo de día o de noche, no, en realidad la Estación Espacial está dando una vuelta al planeta en alrededor de 90 minutos, o sea que en 1 hora y media pasan por el día y la noche.
If you can imagine how they're seating upright, their displays would sort of be looking up towards the direction the nose cone is opened up. And behind them is the trunk of the spacecraft. So that top side, the black shiny part, is actually our solar panels on the body of the spacecraft. And below that, the white side of the spacecraft.
Vamos a sacar un poquito el chat de la vista nada más para poder ver la nave, la Crew Dragon, que está iluminada. Lo que se ve en la parte superior de la Crew Dragon, justo lo sacan, son los paneles solares que tiene para alimentar de energía propia, ¿no?
Has started, and so they're testing to ensure the solidarity of those seals between the hatches. And as we saw earlier, they checked to make sure there was no foreign object debris or FOD, so that they would have a clean seal and be able to complete this leak check successfully. Another step toward undocking.
These leak checks should be pretty fast. They'll be looking to see if there's any pressure rise on the vestibule itself, which would indicate pressure coming through the forward hatch seal.
Pablo pregunta si es la primera vez que se hace un regreso de estas características. No, sí y no. Con esta tecnología que tienen estas naves es la primera vez. La Crew Dragon es la primera vez que hace un viaje tripulado de regreso y es un viaje de certificación. Los Soyuz vienen haciendo hace años este viaje, o sea que no es nada nuevo, ¿no?
SpaceX Dragon, comm checks, Dragon to ground.
I hear you loud and clear. How me?
And Anna, you came in very quiet. I'll bump up that channel and maybe we could try it again.
Copy. How is this?
Elvis pregunta, bueno, ¿por qué es peligroso el reingreso? La atmósfera es un fluido, es aire, pero es un fluido, y a medida que uno atraviesa con tanta velocidad el aire, se calienta. Se calienta tanto que llega a miles de grados de temperatura, donde está la protección de la cápsula, y si no hacen las cosas bien, se prende fuego, ¿no? Pasan a ser un meteorito ingresando.
And Dragon, Houston, on Dragon to ground for a comm check. How do you copy me?
Alexis, tenemos otro video programado. Te recomiendo que mires en el canal y te pongas que activar el recordatorio y apenas estemos en vivo te va a llegar.
Actually, my bad, I was not on the correct loop. Comm check again on Dragon to ground from Houston.
Están haciendo el chequeo de comunicaciones entre la Crew Dragon y su comunicación directa con Houston. Así no dependen de la Estación Espacial.
That's a good data point, and we also have you loud and clear down here.
So we just heard some comm checks between the crew aboard the Crew Dragon and the core here on the ground, and then with the Capcom in Houston. They're two very similar positions. We call ours the Capcom because it stands for Capsule Communicator, and we are in a capsule once again. For a few years there, obviously we were flying a space shuttle, so not quite a capsule, but before that we had Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, all capsules, and this person was once used to be typically an astronaut so that they could communicate any specific details about the vehicle, especially based on their previous experience. Now we have Capcoms who are not necessarily astronauts, but obviously very, very well studied in the vehicle.
Yeah, the way we refer to them is the...
Bueno, acá estamos viendo perfectamente la nave de la Crew Dragon con el cono abierto, los paneles solares hacia arriba, toda la parte negra que está atrás. En realidad son dos partes esa nave, la Crew Dragon que va adelante y el trunk, como le llaman, que es el lugar donde están los paneles solares, que se va a separar, va a regresar solo la parte delantera.
Letting them know where equipment might be stored in the vehicle, letting them know of upcoming steps. If there's any troubleshooting that the crew need to do or information that the crew need, they interact with the crew. Typically also train very closely with the crew in simulations and also during their training periods to get them familiar with all of the procedures that they need to operate in the spacecraft. Now, during those comm checks, there was some discussion about the big loop and Dragon to ground and space to ground, a lot of different loops. Really what a loop just refers to is a communications link. Operators all have the ability to talk on these loops and provide real-time communication. Usually they are redundant loops, so if you had a problem with one of the comm systems, then there's a redundant backup so you can ensure you have good voice communication with the crew. And once we get away from space station outside of the keep out sphere and the approach ellipsoid.
Volvemos de nuevo. La Crew Dragon ahora en esa imagen está con el cono abierto. Eso una vez que se separa va a tapar el cono y tapa el lugar por donde ingresaron los astronautas a la nave, ¿no? Hermosa vista desde el asiento del pasajero vendría a ser, ¿no? Detrás de la tripulación. Nélida, bueno, si ya estás suscripta y tenés las notificaciones habilitadas, cuando habilitemos el próximo video te va a llegar una nueva notificación.
These two spacefarers was not their first flight. They both had two previous shuttle missions, and they both have families that are very
Carlos nos pregunta por qué no se ve la velocidad y no sienten la G. En realidad sí la sienten. Lo que sienten es la ingravidez por la velocidad que se están trasladando en órbita. O sea, lo que le llaman la microgravedad. Eso se debe a la fuerza centrífuga que genera el movimiento circular alrededor de la Tierra y es lo que los mantiene que parece que estuvieran flotando y quietos en el espacio.
They're also bringing something really interesting and with a lot of history to it back to the ground. There was an American flag aboard the International Space Station that flew on the first space shuttle mission and the final space shuttle mission, and it was left aboard the space station. That way it could be retrieved by the next crew who launched from America, and so they are also bringing home that piece of history as well.
Yeah, so I was looking up some facts earlier. The first space shuttle mission in April 1981. So that flag has been to space quite a while, and it's been on station now for about 9 years, which is a pretty long time to be in space.
Yeah, it's probably traveled more miles than any human ever, or any astronaut ever, for sure.
Bueno, el comandante, que creo que es quien va sentado a la izquierda, estaba tamborileando recién en el tablero, ¿no? Está casi tan impaciente como nosotros, me parece.
So if you're just joining us,
Gracias, Pablo,
we're currently
gracias.
looking at two views inside the Dragon spacecraft.
Tenemos las dos cámaras.
Doug Hurley on the left-hand side, or in the left-hand seat.
Dentro de la Crew Dragon.
The Joint Operations Commander.
¿Cuándo va a ser su próximo viaje al espacio? ¿De quién, Mónica? ¿A quién te refieres?
The crew got on board. They've had a relatively busy day packing cargo on board the spacecraft. They closed the forward hatch and the APAS hatch on the pressurized mating adapter on the International Space Station side.
Nos están contando que hoy tuvieron un día bastante agitado porque estuvieron colocando carga dentro de la Crew Dragon, o sea, están trayendo carga de la Estación Espacial hacia la Tierra. Como dato, el peso de la nave al posarse en el mar mañana van a ser 9 toneladas y media, ¿no? La Crew Dragon va a pesar mañana 9 toneladas y media.
From either side.
The International Space Station is also in the current proper configuration for that departure. They do something called feathering the solar arrays, and so what they do is they turn and lock them at an angle. That way, when Dragon leaves the space station, obviously it's going to use its thrusters, and those thrusters have exhaust that are emitted, and we don't want those to contaminate any of the solar cells on the arrays because that makes them less functional. They can't perform as well if they're coated in exhaust, and so those exhaust plumes avoid the solar arrays because they are feathered, and we also just don't want to put extra stress on the solar arrays. So it sounds like the International Space Station and is set up well for the upcoming departure of Crew Dragon.
And as kind of a preview of what's happening on the ground side, so operators and mission control in Houston, and of course operators here, mission control on Hawthorne, looking at the health of the vehicle systems. Right now we are in what are called joint operations because of our proximity to the International Space Station. And so in joint operations, the flight director out of Houston is actually the prime authority for any commanding or anything that'll occur up in space close to the International Space Station. So both teams are conducting health checks against a set of what we refer to as flight rules to check on the health of the vehicle, configuration of the vehicle, and then verifying that their procedures are go for undocking. All those checks happening concurrently with this leak check.
Yeah, and we'll be in those joint operations through the exit of the approach ellipsoid.
Bueno, tenemos confirmación de que la hora del desacople va a ser en 45 minutos. O sea que si tienen algo para hacer, si quieren comer, si quieren tomar su cafecito, dejen el canal encendido y les recomiendo hacerlo ahora. Porque tenemos una gran cantidad de tiempo, no, aparentemente no va a suceder nada. Se dan una vuelta igual por las dudas, pero seguramente van a seguir, por lo que he visto, con esa hora.
If it's inside that keep-out sphere. And then the approach ellipsoid has a little bit of a lesser time frame. You need to be 24 hours safe. And that gives time for the teams on the ground to troubleshoot anything that might arise, as we mentioned, if there were some reason they couldn't send commands to the vehicle or the vehicle couldn't be commanded by the astronauts. So those are typically hold points on the way up for our visiting vehicles. But on the way home, we won't be stopping any. We'll be heading straight for Earth. With a splashdown planned for tomorrow.
Here's an external view of the Dragon spacecraft from the International Space Station. That structure that you see, kind of hemispherical structure on the top, is actually the nose cone. And then on the right-hand side of your screen is that pressurized mating adapter that we saw the crew in earlier. So Commander Chris Cassidy aboard the space station, closing the APAS hatch and Node 2 forward hatch on those two. And of course, Bob and Doug closing the Dragon forward hatch. And much later on in the mission, right before we are planning to step into, right before we really re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, we'll end up closing that nose cone to protect the sensors and thrusters that live underneath it.
Another thing we'll also see happen is the jettison of the trunk. And so the trunk was on the end of Crew Dragon. You could see it had the solar cells wrapped around it, helping Dragon gather power from the sun. And that'll be removed. You can see it again. It's got some fins on it back there. That will not return to Earth with the Crew Dragon capsule. That will actually burn up upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. And that's where, on the way up, we would be able to store any unpressurized cargo. So if there were something that we'd like to install on the outside of the International Space Station, that would be a good place to put it, and the astronauts could use that. It's an extra trunk. I mean, it's exactly what it is. So it's not for any of their personal luggage, but it's great for any of that unpressurized cargo.
Yeah, those aerodynamic fins are actually pretty important. If there were a launch escape event, those aerodynamic fins provide stability to the vehicle as it were to separate from Falcon 9. Of course, we didn't need to see that during this mission, and hopefully we won't see that ever since the in-flight abort mission that happened. And the back on the trunk also contains the thermal coolant loops for the vehicle, so we radiate away heat to space. Of course, on planet Earth, you can sort of just push a breeze by you.
Bueno, ellos deben estar escuchando música también. A veces tamborilean, los vemos, o mueven los pies quizás para no calambrarse, ¿no?
Take advantage of convective heat transfer away from the spacecraft. Although, interesting tidbit, there is just enough of an atmosphere to be a drag, and actually the International Space Station needs to do periodic reboosts to stay in its orbit, right?
And they did one of those very recently. That was factored into Dragon's departure procedures as the International Space Station used its thrusters to reboost it, and in preparation for this October, when it will have a Soyuz vehicle arrive with some brand new crew members. And so this was factored into Dragon's departure sequence, knowing at which altitude the International Space Station would be flying. And it looks right now the International Space Station is flying 262 statute miles over the North Pacific Ocean. It looks like they will be crossing into North America soon, and specifically coming up over the coast of Oregon.
A kind of a preview of what's coming up next. Currently conducting a leak check of the vestibule. Now, particularly important because any breathable gas that you bring with you into space is what you bring on your spaceship. So the International Space Station with a supply of breathable gases, and of course Dragon with tanks aboard that contain nitrogen and oxygen, and the life support system providing periodic injections of oxygen to keep the cabin at about 20 to 25% oxygen, which is about what we would have actually here on Earth. So doing a leak check, making sure that we're not losing any of that precious breathable gas through the forward hatch seal, which has been open really this entire time while we've been on space station.
We've seen a few milestones happen so far today. Of course, we've got a lot to look forward to, but we saw the Dragon hatch close earlier after Bob and Doug were safely inside. Shortly thereafter, Chris Cassidy closed the space station side. That's the APAS hatch, and then eventually the Node 2 hatch. That allowed us to step into this vestibule depressurization period, bringing that space in between those hatches down to as close to a vacuum as we can possibly bring it before departure later. So yes, now conducting those leak checks, and then we will be looking for a go, no go for undock coming up at 4:20 Pacific.
So during that go, no-go for undocking, ground operators will be looking at the health of the vehicle systems, verifying that everything seems pressure and leak tight, verifying the configurations of both the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station.
Tenemos otro video.
And then we'll actually expect to hear...
Tenemos otro video, Oscar, programado para mañana para el reingreso, porque esto va a ser muy largo. Va a ser mañana luego del mediodía, en horario de la tarde. A la pregunta de Álvaro y de Mónica si estos astronautas vuelven al espacio, no creo que vuelvan, ya tienen varios viajes espaciales. Este es un viaje especial porque es un viaje de certificación, por eso están volando ellos. El comandante de este vuelo ya fue comandante del Trasbordador Espacial en el último vuelo que hizo a la Estación Espacial hace más de 9 años, ¿no? Oscar, déjame ver el tema a la hora.
Seconds, and then another for 5 seconds. So I think Gary described them earlier as pulses. I think that's a great way to describe them rather than necessarily as long as a burn. But even our departure burns later are short to start off with. Departure burn 0 looking to be about 12 seconds long, and then departure burn 1 for 20 seconds. And those increase the opening rate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. And after that departure burn 1, they can take off their suits, get comfortable, and relax until time for that deorbit burn tomorrow.
Yeah, the deorbit burn is a pretty big burn, and the departure phasing burn is actually a very
El 21 a 15 GMT es el horario del splash, del splashdown.
The burn will actually be on the order of 9 to 10 minutes. Definitely the largest thrusts of at least the return portion of the mission. And for the phasing burn, that's really to line us up with our potential landing site over Pensacola in the Gulf of Mexico. And the deorbit burn will reduce our perigee, or the lowest point of Dragon's orbit, so that we end up getting caught by the Earth's atmosphere. Dragon will actually then get a chance to use its heat shield and slow down against the Earth's atmosphere. And then once we get to the right sort of pressure characteristics and altitude characteristics as sensed by the vehicle, then we'll have the drogue chutes deploy, slow us down even further before finally seeing those 4 main chutes deploy.
Nélida, la cápsula se desacopla, se coloca arriba de la estación espacial, va a ser dos le llaman encendidas de motor para eso, y luego se coloca delante de la estación espacial y va a permanecer allí hasta mañana a que llegue el momento de hacer el ingreso a la atmósfera, o sea, el encendido para hacer lo que le llaman la de órbita, ¿no? O sea, para poder ingresar. En este momento están terminando con los ajustes, con la despresurización. Eso no es una cosa inmediata. Están faltando todavía unos 25 minutos o 30 minutos para eso.
Just for that brief period of time. That's about how much force they'll experience. Of course, both of them test pilots. Test pilots usually train up to, depending on if you're in the Navy or the Air Force, 7 to 9 Gs. So nothing that they're probably unfamiliar with.
So you've got this really good close-up view of Crew Dragon attached to the International Space Station. Node 2 forward hatch. You can see the nose cone is open. That will be
no tienen un perro ahí, ¿eh? El perro es mío, está en casa. Tenemos una excelente vista ahora del cono de ingreso, donde se comunican para ingresar a la estación espacial. Una vez que se desacoplen, y mañana, antes de hacer el reingreso, van a cerrar ese cono e inclusive van a cerrar todas las tapas que tienen con los sensores exteriores, ¿no?
So some more facts about our astronauts today. We mentioned that they have had 2 previous flights on the space shuttle, and this is their first flight not on a space shuttle, and so they both just logged.
María Eugenia, no se ven las estrellas en el espacio cuando estás viendo otras cosas brillantes como esto que es blanco, que tienen el reflejo de la luz solar. Es lo mismo que sucede cuando están en la Luna. Y es lo que puede suceder si querés mirar el cielo y ver estrellas en el medio de una ciudad en la noche, ¿no? Te deslumbran las luces y no ves cielo, no ves absolutamente nada.
Aboard the International Space Station.
And Bob Behnken actually getting some pretty cool opportunities to conduct a number of spacewalks with Chris Cassidy, going outside the space station, conducting some work to replace power units and batteries on the space station.
Yes, they actually replaced some older nickel hydrogen batteries with some newer lithium ion batteries, and these upgrades have been going on for a few years now. And the astronauts were very efficient. They conducted 4 spacewalks, Chris Cassidy and Bob Behnken. And in the meantime, Doug Hurley was inside, and he was controlling the Canadarm2. That's the robotic arm on the International Space Station. And so all 3 with a very important role in those spacewalks. And it became quite a milestone for Behnken and Cassidy. They both now have conducted 10 spacewalks in their career, and that ties them with the most spacewalks by an American astronaut. They're now tied with 10 with Mike Lopez Alegria and Peggy Whitson.
Dragon SpaceX, we had a good vestibule leak check.
I can copy. It's good news. Thank you.
There's confirmation from the core of successful leak check on the vestibule. That means one more milestone down and getting ready for undock.
Yeah, and that wraps up the completion of those leak checks, as you mentioned, in that small space between Crew Dragon and the space station, the vestibule. It was brought down from a pressure of, it looked like 14.1 pounds per square inch, and then to 5. So they had that hold period and then conducted leak checks. But that 14.1 was the same as the rest of the station. Now they are offset quite a bit, and so they're going to bring that all the way down to vacuum, since that's what they will be exposed to, the hatches, once Crew Dragon Endeavour begins its journey home.
Yeah, and actually, if we didn't bring that space down to vacuum, then it would almost act like a thruster. There'd be a little bit of pressure left up in there, and so as the seals came, or as the seals were sort of...
Interesante, lo que se ve en el medio, en la pantalla del medio, ahora en la Crew Dragon, es una línea sinusoidal. En realidad esa es la trayectoria que están haciendo ellos en la Estación Espacial, ¿no? Patricio, ¿qué tal? De Argentina, ¿cómo anda eso? Buenos Aires, buenísimo. Bienvenido. Humberto, mañana, la transmisión de mañana, esta transmisión de hoy es el desacople con la Estación Espacial. La de mañana es el ingreso a la atmósfera y al océano, ¿no? El reingreso nos están faltando dentro de casi 30 minutos, 28 minutos va a ser el desacople. El reingreso es mañana a las 21:15, horario universal coordinado, UTC. No sé dónde es que estás, pero si colocas 21:15 UTC al lugar donde estás tú en Google, te va a dar el horario exacto. La transmisión va a comenzar unos 30 minutos, unos 3 horas antes más o menos. Y lo interesante se va a poner 1 hora y media. Ahí comienza la parte más interesante.
With those cameras, we're going to get a little pan as the Dragon makes its way away from the International Space Station, and that first departure burn 0, brings it a little bit faster away from the station. We'll get a nice view from the Japanese side of the International Space Station. Right now, the International Space Station configured for undocking. We do have those solar arrays feathered. That's in a locked position.
Station Houston on the big loop. Endeavour's undock sequence start time is planned for 23:30 GMT. That is 28 minutes from now.
You heard that from Capcom here in Mission Control Houston. That is Leslie Ringo here in Mission Control Houston. That start time is 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 6:30 p.m. Central. That is the on-time start time for the undocking sequence. Once that kicks off, that'll be the initiation of the umbilical retraction, followed by 12 hooks that are keeping Dragon in place attached to the International Space Station. Those will drive and be released 6 at a time. They're in 2 gangs. And then, of course, there's 2 undocking burns, more like pulses, just short little burps that are going to physically separate Dragon from the International Space Station vehicle. You can hear right now everything going according to plan. We're right on the timeline. That physical separation, as long as we're on the timeline, should happen at 4:34 and 58 seconds p.m. Pacific time. Everything going well. We'll continue to monitor the depressurization of the vestibule from here in Mission Control Houston. Until then, we'll send it back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. So once Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley arrived at the space station on May 31st, it did not take them long to get to work. During the time on board the orbiting laboratory, as we mentioned, Bob Behnken ventured outside the hatch 4 times for spacewalks to upgrade those batteries, and Doug Hurley used the Canadarm2 to command the station's robotic arm from the inside of the station. But when they weren't focusing on the outside of the station, they continued science and research inside the orbiting laboratory. Of course, as we mentioned, they also exercised the mandatory 2 hours each day. And many of you have seen some of the incredible pictures that they took of our home planet. This is one beautiful view of a sun glint off the ocean. And then there's also one that we have from Comet Neowise in July. If you had the opportunity to see that from the ground, we saw our astronauts had a great shot of that from the International Space Station.
Yeah, they had some really cool opportunities. We're sharing a lot of those photos on Twitter. And of course, you know, earlier this morning, as they've been preparing for undocking, they had some work to do as well in packing cargo into the Dragon spacecraft. So underneath their seats, they've got room for powered and unpowered cargo. Right now, they're bringing home about 150 kilograms, or about 330 pounds of cargo. Most of that is science and sampling hardware. About 94 kilograms, or about 200 pounds of it, is science that's happening aboard the space station. And Dragon does have the ability to return a lot of that cargo, so it can come back to labs here on Earth who can continue to do human science studies on those biological samples and cold sample studies on those cold samples that they're returning. And it's really something that we've been doing even since our previous version of Cargo Dragon, just continuing that capability with Crew Dragon.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to mention. When the astronauts know that there is a Crew Dragon or a Cargo Dragon vehicle coming, they know it's about to get really busy with a lot of science. Because Cargo Dragon is currently the only vehicle cargo resupply ship we have that can bring back cargo. The others disintegrate, burn up in the Earth's atmosphere upon re-entry. So we mentioned earlier that Comet Neowise picture, and I think we have it now. Look at how beautiful that is. The comet streaking across the sky just above the Earth below. I can't imagine.
Yeah,
esa vista del cometa Neowise, ¿no? Desde la Estación Espacial. Y bueno, ahí para Patricia creo que era preguntaba por qué no se ven las estrellas. Ahí se están viendo las estrellas.
And that's, as Gary mentioned, that bay window area on the International Space Station that faces down toward Earth. It's truly the best view in the house. Chris Cassidy might head over there after undocking today to take a look outside and watch as his friends depart. We saw that on the way uphill, he was in there monitoring their arrival and taking some pictures of Crew Dragon as it arrived as well. But aside from all of that science talk, we'll also be returning some vehicle hardware like spacewalking cooling garments, which the astronauts wear under their extravehicular mobility unit suits. There's tubes of water that they can control the temperature of. So when they are in the sun outside of the space station, it can be up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And when they are in the darkness and outside the space station, it can be negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So that cooling garment is also, in a way, a little bit of a heating garment and can help them control their temperature when they're outside on a spacewalk. So we'll be returning some of those. Also some glove connectors for refurbishment back on Earth, and along with any crew provisions like food, small electronics, and even their sleeping bags. NASA will have cargo specialists embedded with the recovery team. They'll be able to quickly recover and unload that returned cargo very shortly after Dragon returns on the recovery ship to shore tomorrow.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. You're mentioning the wide temperature variations. That's something you don't really see on Earth because we have air and we have humidity in the air that helps us sort of regulate that temperature. Of course, you don't have all that humidity and atmosphere around you to help with that. So when you're in the sun, you're getting the full brunt of that heat, and when you're not, you're getting the full coolness of being in eclipse. And so that's part of the reason why you need those extra vehicular suits, as well as like the thermal systems on Dragon, to help regulate that temperature into something that is palatable for humans.
And speaking of heat and atmosphere, when the astronauts re-enter tomorrow, they will be traveling, or they will experience temperatures up to 3,500 degrees outside the crew vehicle. Inside it'll be nice and cool. They've got some air conditioning, and their suits will have cooled air venting through them. So that's a pretty fiery re-entry tomorrow.
Another view on your screen of the Dragon spacecraft, and now looking at a camera that's positioned just behind Bob and Doug. So Doug in the left-hand seat, Bob in the right-hand seat, monitoring the vehicle. Looks like they've got the forward view, so on each of their individual panels. You can sort of tell that because it looks like they've got an attitude ring in front of them. And then they've got a view in the middle that has their procedures and cue cards up for what they can expect next. And speaking of which, actually, so the next thing we'll really see here is final configuration for undocking. So there'll be a go, no-go poll for issuing that final configuration. We're expecting that to happen, the actual command to occur right on time at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time. And then shortly after that, we'll have a couple of those undocking bursts that will just separate any sort of friction, any sort of forces that may have statically built up while Dragon's been hanging out on station. And separation is planned for 4:34 p.m. Pacific time, 4:34 and 58 seconds, actually.
Yes, so from the time that command is sent from the ground to start undocking, as you mentioned, those hooks have to be retracted, those 12 hooks, 2 sets of 6. The umbilical that has been providing power to Dragon from the International Space Station will detach, and they will use those 2 short bursts to begin their journey home.
Yeah, and a lot of those steps are automated. Once we issue the command for undocking configuration, operators here in Mission Control will be monitoring that Dragon performs the correct state transitions. Dragon has flight computers aboard that they're triplicated for redundancy, so if one of the flight computers gets out of sync with the others, you still have the other 2 to make a good call. And of course, we have ways of resetting them and trying to understand those faults. That's part of the job of the mission controllers, to make sure they understand the health and status of the vehicle. So those flight computers will transition the vehicle through a number of states and then activate those thrusters. We'll have a couple of short bursts from the service section Draco thrusters. So those are the thrusters on the lower part of the vehicle, just above the heat shield and the trunk. And we won't be using the forward bulkhead Draco thrusters that are underneath the nose cone. So we'll see those 2 bursts that'll help take Dragon up and above, away from the International Station into a slightly higher orbit, letting Space Station move ahead.
Yes, those will be departure burns 0 and 1. And then that'll just increase the opening rate, the distance from the space station, and moving it out of the keep-out sphere, as we mentioned earlier, and eventually the approach ellipsoid. And then after it's out of the approach ellipsoid, it'll have departure burns 2 and 3. Departure burn 3, as you mentioned earlier, is like a co-elliptic burn. So it puts it on the same orbit all the way around, rather than necessarily having a widely varying apogee and perigee, or higher point of the orbit and lowest point of the orbit.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about the keep-out sphere and the approach ellipsoid. So those are imaginary spheres. The keep-out sphere being a 200-meter radius, I believe, sphere around the International Space Station. So that represents a space where any spacecraft that are in those operations need very choreographed maneuvers with the flight director before they issue any commands or perform any thrusts.
Station and Dragon crew on the big loop. I want to let you know that at this time we are removing ISS power to Endeavour.
Okay.
So a call there from the Capcom saying that both the station crew and, of course, Bob and Doug no longer receiving power from the International Space Station through those umbilicals on the docking mechanism.
Yeah, so Dragon is operating on its own power, generated and gathered by those solar panels wrapped around the trunk of the vehicle. And that's actually a very similar look to the new cargo Dragon. For all of the Dragon missions until now, we saw solar wings with solar arrays, and now the cargo Dragon missions will have the solar arrays wrapped around the vehicle, just like we see here with Crew Dragon.
Yeah, and actually it's something that adds to the overall reliability of the vehicle. Anytime you have a mechanism in space that's potential for something to go wrong, you need a motor to drive it. You need checkouts potentially on the actuators. There's probably software that drives it. So having conformally wrapped solar panels around the trunk of the vehicle reduces that little bit of complexity, and actually ends up being a little bit lighter too, so we can add a little more cargo and add a little bit more to other parts of the system. And on the other side of the trunk is the thermal radiator. So we've got a fluid running through that, almost like an air conditioner. And that fluid is being pumped throughout various different points in the vehicle. Actually, earlier on, we heard a call from the core mentioning that the crew could adjust the hex or heat exchanger to the position that they wanted to control internal cabin temperature. So that part of the cabin air as it goes through the revitalization system is getting passed over that heat exchanger, and that allows the crew to keep it nice and comfortable inside the cabin.
I hope they both like the same temperature, because I like to keep it warm, and I hope they both like it cool or warm, or they can agree on temperature for the long ride home.
Well, taking a look at some of their interviews, I think Bob and Doug have expressed just how close of friends they are. So I'm sure it's something that they've worked out over time. I think earlier I took a look, and it was about 76 degrees Fahrenheit in the cabin, so definitely to my tastes.
Yeah, I could survive in that. And yeah, you mentioned they are very close. They were selected as part of the same astronaut class, so they went through astronaut training together and ultimately remained very close friends, and now get to fly a once-in-a-lifetime mission like this.
Yeah. I mean, flying a test mission together with your best friend has got to be very fun. Of course, our favorite space dads here at SpaceX.
So just a look at these two mission controls. On the left, you have the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, and that's the team that's monitoring and sending signals and controlling the International Space Station side of these operations. It is staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We've always got someone in there protecting the astronauts in space, making sure that everything is working well on the International Space Station. And then on the right, Shiva, why don't you introduce us to the Mission Control Hawthorne?
Yeah, so this is Mission Control in Hawthorne. It's actually right behind us where we're standing here in Hawthorne. And in that room is a number of specialists as well as the primary Dragon operators. Of course, if you've tuned in for some of our other webcasts, you've seen Mission Control as well. We use that same control room for Falcon missions, and that's where the Falcon operators stand in. But today, the third row is where most of the primary operators are, and then we have a number of specialists sitting in other roles, folks who have really devoted the larger part of their careers and a lot of their expertise to understanding the nuances of the life support system or the propellant system, and even, of course, the health and safety of the crew. We have a flight surgeon, actually a NASA flight surgeon, who is in that front row. And he's there as well to make sure that Bob and Doug, if they have any sort of complaints from a physiological perspective, that he can weigh in and help them stay healthy. So really a big team to help make sure that Bob and Doug get home safely, both from the vehicle performing well as their own individual health.
Yeah, and speaking of the vehicle, that vestibule pressure looking now at less than 0.3 psi, so getting down there as close as it can to a vacuum. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that the astronauts have a flight doctor. They have somebody who's specifically assigned to them for all of their pre-flight medical and their in-flight medical and their post-flight. Somebody that is able to speak with them at almost any time and conduct health checks and just wellness checks and make sure that everything is going well while they're in this very, very rough environment of space.
Yeah, I mean, among the cargo that they have aboard is emergency medical kits and actually medical sort of medicine and like trauma kits that they would use if there were a significant medical emergency. And so the flight surgeon can help them as they're working through first aid and give them specific instructions, since if they need to do anything in an emergency scenario, it's those two taking care of each other. And of course, when the hatch was open, the entire International Space Station crew of this expedition taking care of each other. So at this point, we're about 13 minutes away from the transition for undocking, and then about 5 minutes after that, we'll have the 2 undocking burns happen, really just short little bursts from those service section Dracos. We're expecting separation to happen around 4:35 p.m. Pacific time, just a few seconds before that. Heard a go, no-go poll earlier from the mission control teams that we were talking about earlier.
So just like it's during its approach to the International Space Station, Dragon's departure and deorbit is designed to be fully autonomous, so it requires no action from the crew on board. Station Commander Chris Cassidy, he won't be the prime for monitoring Dragon's departure. That'll be done by the crew on Dragon. They'll be able to monitor with these screens you see here, and they'll be backed up by flight controllers on the ground. But as always, Bob and Doug will have the ability to send commands manually to the vehicle if they need to.
And once the undocking sequence is complete, Dragon will then use its Draco engines. It'll thrust away from the station in a series of pretty carefully choreographed maneuvers or 4 departure burns to increase that distance between the 2 spacecraft. And then from there, it'll perform a phasing burn that will put it on the right trajectory to get back to Earth and the landing site.
So next on its trip home is deorbit, entry and landing. And that covers all operations after the final departure remover. That includes trunk separation, closure of the nose cone, deorbit burn, and deployment of the drogue and main parachutes, and finally splashdown off the Florida coast, at which point our teams will recover Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley inside Crew Dragon from the water.
So at this point,
bueno, ante la pregunta de mucha gente cómo calcular, a ver si me escuchan un poco mejor ahora, había olvidado el micrófono. Ante la pregunta de mucha gente de cómo calcular la hora de ingreso en su ciudad, en la ciudad donde están, les cuento, pongan 21:15 UTC y coloquen el nombre del lugar donde están, la ciudad donde están en Google, y hagan una búsqueda. Eso automáticamente le va a dar la hora local de lo que es el splashdown, o sea, el momento de que toca la nave en el océano. Si quieren ver la transmisión, obviamente van a tener que empezar un rato antes. Yo les recomiendo por lo menos una hora y media antes, ¿no?
Something as powerful as those nose cone thrusters, the forward bulkhead thrusters, I should say, just yet. But that's what we will see being used for the deorbit burn tomorrow.
Yeah, those forward bulkhead thrusters just a little bit more efficient because they can expand the propulsive gases a little bit more. Sort of the principle of providing thrust to a rocket vehicle is you burn some kind of propellant or have some kind of gas that you expend from the vehicle, and that mass that you're ejecting away from your launch or from your spacecraft is through Newton's laws pushing you and giving you some momentum. So those forward bulkhead Dracos, when we use the thrust out of those, the propulsive gases in there, we're able to more fully expand than we are on the service section Dracos. Gives us a little bit better performance, but of course they're pointed directly at the space station. So any of that propulsive gas that we're shooting out from Dragon would, of course, go directly then to the space station, which is not ideal.
I just heard the call that Mission Control Houston is go
Dragon
for undocking.
SpaceX on the big loop. The final reconfigurations for undock are complete and nominal. The ground is go for undocking at the...
Bueno, le acaban de dar la orden de que están todos los chequeos completos y y pueden hacer el desacople, el undocking en inglés.
Dragon copies, go for undock on time. Our visors are down and we're ready for departure.
We copy all.
Bueno, el comandante de la Crew Dragon dijo que estaban prontos para partir también, así que tienen todas las confirmaciones.
So now we are waiting for the undocking sequence to actually begin, and they are targeting that for 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, so it looks like 8 minutes from now. And once that begins, it'll take less than 5 minutes for Dragon to separate.
Sí, Daniel, lo vimos, lo de Boca Chica, es genial esto, es el próximo paso de SpaceX. El próximo paso es la nave Starship con el nuevo tipo de motores a metanol.
Space Station Dragon for those to retract. Once those retract, we'll actually have Dragon perform an unlatch from the space station, releasing 12 hard capture hooks that are around the vestibule. Those hard capture hooks are what are providing that airtight seal around the vestibule, and they'll actually come in 2 separate phases. So we'll hear a call for 6 of those, and then we'll hear a call for all of those being detached. And then finally, after that entire process, which takes about 4.5 minutes, then Dragon will be ready to actually depart and push itself away and separate using its Draco thrusters.
Yeah, and so Dragon's initial departure from station is a little different from any of the other docked vehicles like the Soyuz, because that relies on springs to push them away from the docking port. In this case, Dragon will actually execute those 2 short thruster firings to undock. That uses a combination of those 12.
Nos están contando que cómo hacen la Soyuz, la separación. La separación ellos la hacen con un resorte, o sea, cuando se desacopla, el resorte los empuja y eso la separa de la estación espacial. En el caso de la Crew Dragon lo que hace es hacer 2 encendidos de motor.
The vehicle will issue themselves into a state when that command is issued, and actually on the crew displays, on every display, they've got a prominent location that shows what the current states are. They're also able to follow along and see what the state of the vehicle is. So those are the displays that they've got pulled up on their screen right now. That middle display actually has the cards that describe what they can expect to see, along with some inline telemetry that they're getting from the vehicle directly, as well as their current positioning relative to the International Space Station. And then they've also got some views on the side that are each of them in their respective displays that are showing a forward view of the spacecraft as well as the status of those docking hooks. At this point, the umbilicals both still installed because that command has not been issued. And the vestibule should be pretty close to vacuum.
Getting closer every second to that undocking command being sent. We're looking for that in about 5 minutes from now.
Taking a look at data here, I see the vestibule is reading as 0.1 psi. So definitely not very friendly to humans.
Hola Vilma, ¿qué tal?
Throughout the day to bring us to this point with the crew ingressing Dragon, donning their suits, getting in their seats, closing the hatch, and then Chris Cassidy closing the A-pass hatch on the station side, along with that node 2 forward hatch, bringing that space down to as close to a vacuum as possible, and that's where we're at right now. Conducted some leak checks to ensure the seals between those hatches were solid. Everything looking good for an on-time departure today.
Pretty comfy in the cabin right now. You know, that vestibule is pretty near vacuum, but in the cabin it's actually pretty close to what we would see at sea level in still about 76 degrees in there, so pretty comfortable. Of course, Bob and Doug are only partially seeing that. Earlier, they closed down their visors, and so the suits that they're wearing protect them in the event of a depressurization event. They also protect them if there was a fire on board, as they're made of fire-resistant materials. And so as we're getting to this critical step of separating from the space station, if something were to go wrong here, those suits would provide that critical life support to them, pressurizing if the cabin pressure were to unexpectedly drop. It's actually part of the reason why
los pasos más importantes son los dos encendidos de motor que van a tener en estos momentos y que va a separar la Crew Dragon de la Estación Espacial. Se va a colocar primero encima y luego hacia adelante.
That leak check performed earlier with no findings, showing the vehicle is nominal and ready for undocking.
And as once we mentioned, that undocking will take a few minutes before we actually see the separation occur. But once the command is sent, those 12 latches will be retracted, the umbilical will be disconnected. Dragon is already on internal power, however. It's not receiving any power from the International Space Station. But once that umbilical is retracted, those hooks are removed. Be looking for those 2 short bursts to send Dragon on its way, and then things will speed up with those departure burns afterward. Just a couple of minutes away from that on-time undocking. That'll be 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 11:30 p.m. GMT, or the time that the astronauts use aboard the International Space Station.
Bueno, están a 2 minutos del desacople. ¿Qué tal, Ubaldo de Buenos Aires? ¿Cómo anda eso? Y hola, Leonel y Cristian, Tandil. Bienvenidos.
Looking for the undocking command to be sent in just about 30 seconds.
And again, a quick preview of what we expect to happen. Umbilicals will retract, then we'll see those docking hooks disconnect, and then we'll actually see those undocking burns.
Bueno, lo que va a suceder en el desacople es que se desengancha, hay unos ganchos que se sueltan y un cordón inclusive que los une, y luego van a hacer el encendido de los motores. Ahí estamos viendo en la pantallita de la izquierda de las 3 que están allí. Bueno, estábamos viendo, nos cortaron la imagen en este momento. A ver si... No, están cortados los 2 canales justo en este momento. Es increíble.
The International Space Station flying 263 statute miles over Namibia in Africa.
Dragon SpaceX umbilical demate complete and nominal.
Bueno, se acaban de soltar en este momento.
There's confirmation of the umbilicals retracted,
están en la sombra,
so no longer receiving power or data or commanding from the International Space Station. And there's a view on your screen of
en este momento hay confirmación de que están sueltos.
Gary, how's it looking for mission control at Johnson?
We're looking good, Shiva. We are now inside the undocking sequence. Good umbilical retraction. Standing by for the driving of those hooks. There's 12 hooks that will be released in 2 gangs of 6. Standing by for the driving of the hooks. Here we have good motion on the primary set of hooks.
La luz verde es la luz de navegación esa. De un lado es rojo y del otro lado es verde. Para saber la hora en el lugar que estamos, coloquen 21:15 UTC y el nombre de la ciudad donde están, y eso Google les va a dar la hora que va a tocar el mar, el splashdown. ¿Qué tal? Bueno, un saludo también a toda la gente que se ha sumado.
Again, we are inside of the undocking sequence now. Good umbilical retraction, and we're driving the first set of hooks.
Dragon SpaceX, first set of hooks open and nominal.
Bueno, dice que están siguiendo todos los pasos de la secuencia de desacople. El cordón de unión ya está suelto también.
The first 6 hooks have completed their driving first set down. The second set is now driving. We're now committed to undock.
Inclusive dice que los ganchos, hay 6 ganchos del total, no sé cuántos son el total, ya están desenganchados. ¿Qué tal, Ángel Gabriel de México? Bienvenidos también, y bienvenido de España, Rubén. 21:15 UTC y colocas el nombre de la ciudad y eso te da la hora local. Esa hora es la hora de que van a tocar el agua, o sea, el splashdown. Todo va a comenzar 1 hora y media o 2 antes. Sí, estamos todos esperando el desacople.
Seeing good motion on that second set of hooks. Continuing to drive. These will be the final set of hooks. There's 6 of them holding Dragon into place now.
Están soltándose los otros 6 ganchos de amarre en este momento. Pablo, ¿qué tal? Sí, pero estoy en tierra ahora, es mucho más tranquilo esto que estar volando. ¿Qué tal, Williams, de Panamá? Maximiliano, de Argentina, pregunta cuándo amerizan. Mañana en la tarde. 5 o 6 horas de la tarde.
Dragon SpaceX, all
De Chile, Penco. ¿Qué tal, Lorenzo? Bienvenido. Y de Argentina, ¿cuál foto y video? Otro colega que hace foto y video. Bueno, ahí vemos que se está separando, ¿eh? En este momento se está separando. Dragon Departing, esa fue la voz.
Separation confirmed.
Bueno, está confirmada la separación.
Great burns. Physical separation 4:35 p.m. Pacific.
Bueno, así se ve la separación desde la estación espacial. Estamos viendo de una cámara colocada en la estación espacial cómo se aleja la Crew Dragon en este momento. Se ve su luz roja del lado de uno de los lados, su luz verde del otro, y el beacon que prende y que apaga en el medio, ¿no? Depende del lado que lo vemos también, es de donde le dé o no Vemos el verde de un lado y el rojo del otro. Mariano, ¿qué tal? Bienvenido también, sí. Uruguayo, sí. Saludos, Soriano, bienvenido, Dolores.
Depart burn 0 complete. That 12-second firing, moving Dragon slightly faster away from the International Space Station using those service section Dracos.
Bueno, Katy pregunta cuándo regresan. Esta es la secuencia de regreso. Son 19 horas de aquí hasta que mañana en la tarde se posen en el océano, frente a la Florida. Lo que sí ya hicieron la cuarentena, ¿no? Tienen la cuarentena a bordo de la estación espacial.
We'll be monitoring Crew Dragon throughout the departure sequence, but with Dragon flying free, that'll do it from us here in Mission Control Houston. Godspeed, Bob and Doug. To take you through the rest of the departure sequence, we'll send you back over to Hawthorne.
Toda esta secuencia es automática, a pesar de que los pilotos tienen la posibilidad de manejarla manualmente y hacerlo todo manual. De hecho, en el ingreso, cuando hicieron el acoplamiento hace el 30 de mayo, ellos probaron los comandos manuales para hacer todo manual. Esta es la vista desde la Crew Dragon. Así se ve la estación espacial desde a bordo. Tenemos una cámara, estamos viendo la cámara arriba de la Crew Dragon.
Beautiful view, just had a beautiful view there of the relative navigation sensors providing an infrared view of the International Space Station as Bob and Doug drift away from it. And of course, as they are drifting away, going into that slightly higher orbit, just because of balancing the force of gravity along with their centripetal acceleration, they will move a little bit slower than the space station. And so we'll expect space station to sort of drift ahead, and then as they conduct those additional burns, getting out of the approach ellipsoid and the keep out sphere, then they will come back down below space station with their apogee being about 10 kilometers below space station and slowly reducing their perigee.
Next up in just a couple of minutes, scheduled for 4:40 p.m.
La estación espacial y la Crew Dragon se están moviendo ahora a 27.000 kilómetros por hora en una órbita alrededor de la Tierra. No se aprecia velocidad porque entre ellas no hay velocidad. La velocidad que hay entre ellas es esta, la separación entre una y otra, nada más, ¿no?
Of Bob's display is a relative navigation sensor
28,
that's providing an infrared view from the forward hatch of Dragon, looking back towards the forward module of the International Space Station. So that's where Dragon has been for the last 63 days. Coming up in less than a minute is departure burn number 1.
Los Simpsons predijeron todo, ¿no?
This burn coming just about 5 minutes after separation.
Bueno, ya llevan 5 minutos.
This is going to increase that opening
y
rate
vemos cómo se sigue alejando
between the space station and Dragon.
And separation occurred on time today, as with
hay lo que ellos le llaman una burbuja de protección alrededor de la imaginaria, alrededor de la estación espacial, donde no permanece, o sea, si hay alguna nave ahí, esa nave tiene que estar en contacto con el centro de control de emisión. Están en África en este momento, dice, al sur de Madagascar. Maximiliano, gracias por la info. Sí, recordemos que la estación espacial da una vuelta alrededor del planeta en aproximadamente 90 minutos. Sí, está en reversa. La pregunta es si la Crew Dragon va en reversa. En este momento sí, en la separación está yendo en reversa en relación a la estación espacial. Juanjo, gracias, Juanjo. De Salinas. Sí, tengo entendido que son 27.000 kilómetros por hora la velocidad de la estación espacial. Bueno, ahí vemos dos puntitos en la pantalla, esos dos puntitos verde y rojo y la cámara que se movió, es la Crew Dragon que se está alejando. Los puntos cada vez se ven más cerca, o sea, son las luces de navegación.
And departure burn 1 has begun, that 20-second burn. This will also take it outside of the keep out sphere and outside of the approach ellipsoid, and after complete.
Dragon SpaceX depart burn 1 complete. Nominal burn, you are go to doff your suits per procedure 4.012. Reminder that the ground will be deactivating the big loop following exit from the approach ellipsoid, which is approximately 12 to 14 minutes from now.
Okay. Station Endeavour on the big loop.
Go ahead, Endeavour.
Chris, we just can't thank you enough. It's been an honor and a privilege to be part of Expedition 63 with you, Anatoly, and Ivan.
Tino, te recordamos el lenguaje, por favor.
All you've done as a crew to help us prove out Dragon on its maiden flight. I'd also like to thank Zeb and his team in Mission Control.
Sí, a la pregunta del tablero, sí, esta nave es la nave más moderna que hay y el tablero es así, tiene 3 pantallas touch y muy pocos botones. Todos los comandos se hacen desde la operativa touchscreen. Les recomiendo buscar un video que tenemos en nuestro canal de un paseo adentro de la nave esta que lo hizo uno de los pilotos hace poquito cuando estaban a bordo de la Estación Espacial. Sergio, ¿por qué demoran tanto? Bueno, normalmente demoran entre 6 y 30 horas. Depende un poco de cómo esté en ese momento alineada la órbita de la Estación Espacial con respecto al punto que quieran ingresar y a lo que programe el control, obviamente. En este caso ellos van a tener un tiempo de descanso que hablaban de que iba a ser unas 3 horas de descanso entre medio de una cosa y la otra, ¿no? En este momento lo que están haciendo es colocándose atrás, van a ir por arriba de la Estación Espacial y se van a colocar luego adelante, ¿no?
Kind words exchanged between Crew Dragon Endeavour with Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley now on their way home.
ISS and Dragon on the big loop. Endeavour has exited the keep out sphere. See you guys when you're back home.
La Crew Dragon se va a mantener, o sea, si quieren saber cómo puedes hacer para traquearla, traquear la Estación Espacial, porque de acá hasta las próximas 17 horas van a seguir volando juntas. Están separadas unos metros, pero van a seguir volando juntas.
So you just heard they exited the keep out sphere. That's an imaginary sphere, 200 meters in diameter, and that is around the space station. So it's one of the several safety zones set up to govern any visiting spacecraft either arriving or departing the station. Before moving into the keep out sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross that boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if, as we mentioned, the spacecraft were to, for some reason, lose all of its maneuvering capabilities.
Yeah, and that capability, really what we're looking to hear is that the spacecraft is what's called on what's a, I am having such a hard time saying that.
You'll get there.
It's on a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. And that's what the call that we're hoping to hear from. So exactly as you mentioned, Leah, if we were to completely lose commanding authority over the spacecraft, we would want to make sure that we wouldn't potentially re-interact with the International Space Station in an uncontrolled way. And so these burns helping us to get out and away from the space station in a way that we could, if something were to go catastrophically wrong on the vehicle, protect the crew aboard the space station, of course the crew aboard the spacecraft until you were able to recover. Of course, Dragon spacecraft has been really rock solid this entire mission and has a lot of redundancy into it. So that scenario is pretty unlikely, but it's a good safety standard that we design all of our spacecraft to.
And this departure burn 0 and 1, as we mentioned, is bringing Dragon up and over the International Space Station. It's not just making a straight journey home. That will be determined later once the phasing burn is complete, and then the deorbit burn, which commits us to leaving space to bringing Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley back into Earth. The next
Dragon on Dragon to ground comm check with the cabin mic.
I hear you loud and clear on Dragon to ground. How me?
Loud and clear, Anna.
As we heard, they are now testing out the cabin mic, so they may be beginning to doff their suits, take off their suits, which is allowed now that the first 2 departure burns have been completed. And the next is scheduled for 5:27 p.m. Pacific time. That'll be depart burn 2, and that'll be 12:27 a.m. GMT. So it's really the middle of the night for the space station crew right now, and they'll be getting ready to go to sleep pretty soon. But our astronauts are awake for several more hours before they get their sleep period later.
Cortaron la transmisión desde la Crew Dragon ahora porque lo que van a hacer los astronautas ahora es quitarse los trajes y hacer tareas dentro de la nave. Lo que viene ahora es va a ser recién dentro de, no sé, un montón de horas, así que aparentemente no nos van a mostrar más nada.
Away from the space station on its way out, close to exiting the approach ellipsoid, Bob and Doug can get out of those spacesuits and get into something a little bit more comfortable. And that test step of verifying the cabin mic, the spacesuits actually have 2 microphones in them, just towards the near the jaw, actually in the base of the helmet. And so with Bob and Doug removing those spacesuits, they're testing their cabin mic just to make sure that they still have good communications with the crew operations responsible engineer here in Hawthorne. So we should expect a few more calls here as Dragon moves away from the approach ellipsoid. We heard a couple of calls from the Capcom as well about deactivating the big loop, so to speak, and transitioning to Dragon to ground. The big loop is a comm network that connects flight controllers and Mission Control Houston, the International Space Station crew, visiting vehicles, and of course, like our Mission Control team here in Hawthorne, all together on one comm loop so we can all communicate with one another if anything needs immediate attention. As we step out of integrated operations or joint operations with the International Space Station, we'll transition into mission control here in Hawthorne, having mission authority, and transition all of those calls to the Dragon to ground loop.
Yeah, so life on space station is kind of back to normal now that Dragon has departed, and they are still monitoring the departure, the crew on board Crew Dragon specifically.
Muchas gracias a todos. Bueno, con esto terminamos la transmisión del día de hoy. Nos vemos mañana. Recuerden, mañana a las 19:15 UTC. Busquen 19:15 UTC y pongan el nombre de la ciudad de ustedes en Google y ahí van a tener la hora. Pero ya tenemos un video pronto y creado en nuestro canal, que si están suscritos al canal, les recordamos, vamos a poner el cartel de suscribirse acá. Con la suscripción y habilitado las notificaciones, van a enterarse en el momento en que empecemos a transmitir. Pero de todas maneras, el video ya está cargado en nuestro canal. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Un abrazo grande. Que pasen lindo.
And coming up after that approach ellipsoid exit, we'll also have